to Kirby for inviting me and for that great introduction which I wrote. So, so just first of all, to give you a brief idea of how this book happened. I grew up in Montana, like most of us. I loved it here, and then I left for various reasons, and it kept drawing me back, and I moved back in 2007. I had already published my first two novels by that time, so I kind of felt like I had a pretty good grasp of what Montana was about, because I had done a lot of research and stuff for those books, especially the first one. But, when I came back, I quickly realized after visiting a few places and talking to people and just hearing people talk about Montana that I didn't know it as well as I thought I did. And, I as far as trying to figure out the best way to solve that problem, I thought, well, someone had suggested to me like 15 years ago that I do this project, that I go to every county in the state and write about it. And I was dating a editor at the time, this woman who was in the business, and she said nobody would buy it. So I sort of thought she was the expert, and so I dismissed the idea, but it came back to me when I moved back here, and I thought, that there's probably no better way to get to know the state and what's happening and what's going on than to see if that project, if I can get that off the ground. So I suggested it to my editor, and he was all over it. He basically said I would publish that. He hadn't seen any of it even, but so having that kind of confidence is always nice. And I did a Kickstarter campaign to raise money for the trip, and the basic reward for that, anybody that donated to that was, they would get a free book at the end when it came out. So it was nice to have those books already promised, so I knew I'd sell a few. And, it was interesting because my attitude toward the whole project really changed when I got that Kickstarter campaign money, because I thought, wow, I'm responsible to the people that have contributed to this to do a good job here. I can't just do what I want to do. And I took that very seriously. I decided, for one thing, that I needed to approach this as if I don't know Montana at all. And that's kind of that's the approach I tried to take. Of course, it's not always that easy, but so yeah, I started my journey. I traveled all over and talked to people. Most of it was very spontaneous. I had a few interviews set up in advance, but I wanted it to be as instinctive and spontaneous as possible, just to get a feel for what people are thinking about, and so that they didn't have prepared comments. I didn't talk to very many politicians. And the result was really interesting. I loved it. I loved every minute of it. And then when I started writing it, that was a challenge because I wasn't sure how to approach it. But it ended up, I tried several different approaches. The first was just writing one county at a time, and that felt really dry and boring. Felt like a travel guide, basically. So I ended up separating the chapters by industry. So there's chapters about logging, the railroad, mining, ranching, all the things Montanans know well. So yeah, and I decided also early on that I wasn't going to go halfway with this. I decided I needed to be as honest as possible about what I saw. And so I think what came out of it was a fairly sometimes critical look of the state, but the the strongest impression I got from my trip was that people love this place, and they are incredibly devoted to Montana. And that it doesn't matter how bad things are, the people in this state are determined and always optimistic that they're going to turn around. So that was a great discovery. And, of course, it made me fall in love with the state all over again in even completely different ways. So I'm going to read a few sections for you. This is the introduction. I have a secret to share with you. It's about this whole Montana mystique, the magic of this place. I've lived in 12 different states in the past 30 years, and I've always been amazed by how people respond. Turn off your cell phones. Jeez, that's crazy. Okay. Let's try that again. I've lived in 12 different states in the past 30 years, and I've always been amazed by how people respond when they hear I'm from Montana. Not always, of course. Some people can't even place Montana. They sometimes know it's somewhere near Canada, and others see it as just another small part of that big empty space between New York and California. But I often came across people who said, "Oh, I love Montana. Have you been there?" "No, but it looks so beautiful in the pictures. I've always wanted to go." A lot of people want to come here. And of course, there are the inevitable questions, sometimes entirely baffling. A friend of mine was recently asked, "Do you guys have grocery stores there?" Montana is a place whose vast expanses are really impossible to comprehend until you've been here. I was recently talking to someone who works at the wind farms in Wheatland County, and he told me about the owner of the company coming from Chicago to visit the work site. He said he was just going to catch a cab from the airport in Billings. I said, "I don't think you want to do that." So he asked me whether there was a train. I said, "No. I'll tell you what, I'll just come and pick you up." Another friend tells a story about when he first moved to Montana and he had to drive to Great Falls for business. This guy was giving me directions and he said to turn left at Eddie's Corner. So I asked him what that was and he said, "Oh, it's a gas station." I thought, wait, I'm driving 200 miles to get to this town and I'm supposed to pick out one gas station to know where to turn? But of course, when I got to Eddie's Corner, it made complete sense. For decades, the West, and Montana in particular, has developed a reputation as a place where you can go to start over, to create a whole new persona, or to become the person you always envisioned. It's the kind of place where a week-long trip to one of the more picturesque locales fuels the imagination. The fresh air, the huge sky, and the wide open space instills in you a belief that anything is possible. It's a place where starting over can move from concept to reality in the course of a walk around Bozeman or a drive along Flathead Lake. But here's the secret. The secret is that we Montanans are completely bipolar. That's right, we're up and down like a goddamn bucking horse. Not all of us, of course, but as a state. As one big entity, we are completely manic depressive. Why do I say that? Well, in February of 2014, Gallup did a survey to determine the happiest states in Montana, or in America, and Montana finished number one. That's the image most people have, right? That's the idea you get when you visit this place. People are friendly as hell. They really do seem happy. You rarely get that shiver up your spine where the friendliness seems to be hiding some slimy ulterior motive. People in Montana let you go first because it doesn't matter whether they go first. They smile at you on the street because there's no good reason not to. But here's the other side of it. That same year, 2014, several studies listed Montana in the top 3 for suicide. And for the last 40 years, we have been in the top 5 every single year. So what the hell does that mean? How is that possible? How can a place that is the happiest in the whole country, what? Well, that's one of the many things I wanted to address in this book. For one thing, there is an inherent pressure when you live in Montana to be happy. Seriously, if you can't be happy here, what the hell's wrong with you? But of course, it's way more complicated than that. Much of the explanation goes back to the very beginning when Montana first came into being, or at least the current form of Montana when it was settled. From the start, the narrative about our history has been altered or often completely rewritten in order to support the actions of certain people. From the start, those who wrote our history were so intent on shining a bright light on Montana that they ignored many of the pertinent facts, particularly the shadows. And perhaps the most troubling aspect of this is that many of those who wrote or made movies about the West did not even live here. From the time Owen Wister came out with The Virginian, which is considered the first great Western, writers have been presenting the stereotypical Westerner as stoic, self-contained, multi-talented, and completely cool under pressure. But Wister was a lawyer from back east, a law school friend of Teddy Roosevelt's, who came west a few times as a rich tourist. The American West was built around misconceptions and misdirection. And although most of us who live here know this by now, especially after decades of wonderful historians digging deep enough to tell the real story, many of these misconceptions still persist, not only here, but worldwide, because they have become an important part of the American culture. They still justify certain behaviors. They romanticize the idea that men who ride into town and take care of business are the kind of men we need. The number of American presidents and other world leaders who have posed on horses or in various Western activities is hilarious and frightening. From Reagan chopping firewood to Putin sitting shirtless in the saddle, leaders have found ways to align themselves with this old John Wayne mentality, and it seems to work. It tells the public, I'm a man of action. I can handle an axe and I look good on a horse. Look at Teddy. He was actually known as the cowboy president. And he not only relished that image, but he perpetuated it, partly because it was based on fact, because he lived it for a few years. But there was a dark side to Theodore Roosevelt's time out west, and that contradiction fits right in with our whole bipolar history. Roosevelt moved here and built a cattle ranch when he was still in his 20s, after he lost both his wife and his mother on the very same day in the same house from completely unrelated illnesses. He spent the next several years immersing himself in a world of physical labor, raising cattle and hunting like a fiend. The number of animals Roosevelt killed in his time out west is estimated in the thousands. It doesn't take a professional to figure out there was probably some escapism going on there. Roosevelt never mentioned his wife's name again as long as he lived, even in his autobiography. So you could say it worked for him. But none of us will ever know how much pain he buried over those tragic events. It could very well be what drove him to accomplish as much as he did. It's well documented that he was a man who couldn't sit still. Many wonderful journalists and historians have told this story before, and this is intended as just one more contribution to the growing narrative of this place. It's just one man's take on the contradictions and complexities that are Montana. Because a story this big and this complicated needs to be told over and over again. So one of the things that was really, really fascinating to me was the real story of Beaverhead County and Bannock and Virginia City and all the vigilante stuff. How many have read A Decent Orderly Lynching? Here we go, one. It's a fascinating story. So I stole a lot of stuff from that guy. This is a little bit about that. The job of rewriting our past started from the beginning with the very first book ever published in Montana, The Vigilantes of Montana. Thomas Dinsdale, who was the editor of the Montana Post in Virginia City, wrote this book just after some very interesting events unfolded around him. The book reads like an article from a local sports page, as if Dinsdale was celebrating the heroic feats of the high school football team. Although much has been written about these events, my own personal favorite being A Good Orderly Lynching by Frederick Allen, their importance can't be overstated. Dinsdale was a colorful writer and by all accounts a fine reporter, but he also had to live in the same community as the vigilantes. during a time when everyone was walking those dusty streets in complete fear. Between the Native Americans and the road agents that finally inspired the vigilantes to action, and finally the vigilantes themselves, people never knew when they might be attacked, pulled aside, and questioned, beaten, or strung from a tree. Dimsdale seems to have been convinced that he was reporting the events in an unbiased manner, but he had little chance of not being biased toward the vigilantes when it came right down to it. His life depended on it. Those who spoke out against them, and that included two of the most prominent lawyers in the region, James Thurman and H.P.A. Smith, often found themselves chased out of town by threats of death. A few years after being exiled, Thurman filed a defamation suit against one of the founders of the Vigilance Committee and won a settlement of $8,000 in a Utah court. These guys didn't like anyone pointing out when they were in the wrong, and they were often in the wrong. Toward the end of their activities, toward the end of their reign, a man was hung just for expressing his disapproval of their activities. And they continued their campaign despite direct orders from federal judges to cease and desist. Today, at first glance, it's impossible to imagine that the 60-mile stretch between Bannock and Virginia City could inspire that kind of greed that led to the dozens of men being hung. There's nothing the least bit remarkable about the area where Bannock sits now, which no doubt explains why nobody lives there anymore. But for several years, this area was the number one destination for people moving west. It's even hard to imagine when you consider that most of these pioneers traveled thousands of miles, mostly by horse and wagon and often on foot, before there were actual roads. It's impossible to imagine until you understand the reason, which was, of course, gold. I'm going to jump from there to another town that was sort of influenced by mining. The Berkeley Pit, in just the right light, looks disturbingly like scarred human flesh, as if a chunk of someone's leg has been gouged out and healed over without proper medical care. And yes, that's a blatant metaphor for what this hole represents for the town of Butte. It's hard to imagine another town in Montana, if not in America, where the residents have given so completely of themselves with so little return. Butte is the closest I've ever seen to a town that looks like it's been lifted directly from a Dr. Seuss book. It consists of a series of steep hills with houses that sometimes look as though they've been slapped together, perched precariously on those sharp angles so that any slight tremor could send them tumbling, and all of it completely charming. And yet, in the midst of some of those most dilapidated houses, which, despite their appearance, are probably inhabited, you also find stunning pieces of architecture. As a matter of fact, there are almost 6,000 structures in Butte that are listed in the National Historical Directory, more than any other town in America. Think about that for a minute. It's easy to imagine a delightful Seussian children's book about this place, with a pit that is swallowing up half the town. It's almost comical, this massive hole, except that at the bottom of it lies a festering pool of toxic waste that has become an environmental puzzle. It's a lake, really, more than 1,000 feet deep. For years, no one knew what to do about this pool, although there is finally a plan in place. There's even a website called Pitwatch dedicated to giving updates on the progress. Butte is a classic example of what happens when the awkward dance between commerce and conservation is dominated by commerce. There's no evidence here of trickle-down economics. But there's more than ample evidence of a greedy few packing their bags and leaving a mess behind. In fact, as I drive around this town, especially up toward Walkerville, where the streets lose their senses, no matter which way I turn, I feel more lost than I was before. I get the strongest sense that a silly children's rhyme would be an insult to this place. That whatever Grinch lingered in the hills above this town stole more than the pretty packages under the people's trees, more than the baubles hanging from those branches, more than the trees themselves. These crooked streets have the feel of a place where tragic things happened. And of course, after hearing Butte's story, you learn that the tragedy that took place in this town is way beyond anything you can imagine. You learn that the Grinch that created this place had hearts that were way more than 3 sizes too small. There were a few humorous incidents. This is one from Thompson Falls. Doug is a visual artist who volunteers at an artist co-op on Main Street in Thompson Falls. He grew up on a sheep ranch just outside of town, but left the area to pursue a career as a teacher. Although he left Thompson Falls, he never left Montana, moving around to different school districts before retiring in what was to become an increasingly familiar story. He decided to return to the town where he grew up. He now lives with his parents on the ranch where he was raised, although they no longer run the place. They leased out the land to other local ranches. Doug's memories of Thompson Falls in his youth were happy ones, much like those of many small-town boys, burning the point, driving up and down Main Street looking for girls or someone to buy beer in their parents' cars, or frequenting the local movie theater. He told me how exciting it was when they finally got a phone on the ranch. They were on a party line, of course, and Doug said that one of their neighbors was notorious for listening in on others' conversations. She was also fond of baking. So one day when Doug was on the phone with his cousin, he heard the familiar breathing. He made a sniffing noise and said, "Hey, do you smell cookies burning?" Which was followed by a squeal and the click of the receiver. Minutes later, as the boys were still laughing, she came back on just long enough to say, "That wasn't very nice." The volunteer working at the Sanders County Museum in Thompson Falls was a delightful character, an older man who couldn't hear a word. I would find as I went further along that most of these small-town museums are all pretty quiet, with not a lot of visitors, but because I didn't know that yet, it didn't strike me as odd that this museum was very busy that day. The old man tottered around asking each of the visitors where they were from, and you could just see from the look on his face that he was delighted to be there and couldn't wait to have someone ask him a question so he could be useful. He smiled at everyone through thick glasses so thick they looked like frosted glass, and he asked questions in a voice like Andy Devine, one of the character actors they used to trot out for every Western ever made, the buddy of the main character. There was a young family there, and at one point a little blonde girl came rushing down the stairs, trying to keep up with her sister, asking anyone who would listen where her daddy was. The old man somehow heard her, and it became his mission to find the answer to her question. He did not hear the mother tell the little girl that her father was in the restroom, so he started to climb the stairs, which was a task. He moved slowly, chuckling to himself, making an occasional noise that indicated some physical ailment that made the climb painful. The little girl raced up the stairs past him, clueless, and he chuckled again, following her, asking whether she found her daddy. She didn't answer, and he continued to the top of the stairs, where I could hear his heavy footsteps wandering, looking for the father, who by this time had emerged from the restroom and was looking at the displays downstairs. Everyone else in the museum was oblivious to this drama, and it warmed my heart to think that our state is still full of people like this, people who worry about little things like a girl being separated from her father. Let's see. So, most of you know there's a difference between western and eastern Montana. This is part of that. There is no line marking the change from western Montana to eastern Montana. Whether you're driving along Highway 2 from Kalispell to Cut Bank or traveling east along Highway 90 from Bozeman, you won't see a sign that says, "Welcome to eastern Montana." but you will notice the difference. I used to say that eastern Montana was flat until I married a woman from Savannah, Georgia. When I brought her to Montana and we drove across the eastern part of the state, she said with some degree of disbelief, "This isn't flat. This isn't flat at all." I didn't grasp how she could say that until we did a similar road trip through Georgia. Of course, she was right. Although there are definitely long stretches, especially on the High Line where you can see for miles, the terrain in eastern Montana is almost never flat. There are subtle changes everywhere. But you can drive for hours without seeing as much as a handful of trees, and those are generally shelter belts. But a closer look at this half of the state reveals a land that is rich with texture. Whether it's a long, delicate slope or a hidden coulee, there are indications everywhere that the elements have been hard at work. But much of eastern Montana is an acquired taste, especially if you expect something like the majesty of the mountains. This kind of open country seems to attract two very different types of people and create two kinds of towns. First, there's a town like Fort Benton, where every place you go, people greet you like a long-lost relative. There are many towns like this in eastern Montana where the people appear to be living rich, happy lives. The other extreme is a little harder to grasp. And to an outsider, I'm sure it can be intimidating. But in most of the smaller towns in eastern Montana, what you're going to encounter when you first walk into the local cafe is the stare. Those who encounter the stare shouldn't panic. Although at first glance, the stare suggests you might want to turn around and go back to your car, the explanation is pretty simple. The stare comes from seeing the same 25 or 30 people day after day for the past 5 or 10 years. You're suddenly presented with someone they've never seen before. You're a specimen that needs to be studied and analyzed. The stare may seem rude at first, but it's really a compliment. You are exotic, worthy of examination. You're something they can spend a good hour talking about later. There was some sad stories. And of course, there was one right there, geez. It's just incredible to me what people lived through in the early days here, and so I was just really moved by a lot of the stories people told about that period of Montana's history, and this was one of the more striking ones. Of course, this woman was the only one, I think, that didn't ask me not to use her name, so. In the summer of 1939, when a woman I will call Mary was about 4 years old, she and her sister were playing in the yard of their home near a small Montana town when a blue 36 Ford coupe pulled into the yard. A young couple emerged from the car, accompanied by a girl younger than they were. The two girls raced into the house in anticipation of what brought these strangers. The couple entered the house without knocking through the kitchen and into the living room, where the girls had joined their mother and father. Moments later, these two young girls were shocked to find out that these people they had known as their parents were not their parents. As the woman declared abruptly and unceremoniously that the girls would from this day forward refer to her as mother and to the man with her as daddy, and that they were to refer to the woman they had thought was their mother as Graham. They then left without fanfare, leaving the girls behind with this revelation. Mary was to learn much later, after several years of a living hell with this couple, that her grandparents were not the only two people in the room who were stunned. The man with their mother had no idea that his wife had 2 other children, who were obviously not his, nor did her parents have any idea that their daughter had a 3rd child. Mary would also eventually find out that her real father, whom she'd never met, died several months after completing the Bataan Death March in the Philippines. A few months later, Mary's mother and her stepfather, whom I will call Eddie, came and retrieved the girls to live with them so that they could be closer to a public school. But that was about the only positive. Over the next few years of their lives, they were shuttled from one tar paper shack to another, while Eddie worked as a ranch hand or in mining camps. My mother treated our younger sister as if she could do no wrong, but we ran the constant risk of a beating with a razor strap for dropping one of the eggs or stepping in excrement when we went to relieve ourselves behind the barn, since we didn't have an outhouse. None of the shacks we lived in had electricity or running water. Often when her younger sister went down for her afternoon nap and while Eddie was at work, Mary's mother would doll herself up and instruct the girls not to wake up their sister, and she would sneak off for trysts. Mary would later learn that her mother had spent several years as a prostitute in Butte. There are several things about Mary's story that are pertinent to our history. The most obvious is the fact that in a place where the Depression lasted 10 years longer than it did in most of the country, people often had to resort to the most desperate measures to survive. History often presents this period as a time that brought out the best in people, as they had to help each other out and do whatever it took to get through. But not everyone fit that mold, and for people like Mary's mother, the desperation to survive led to a kind of self-preservation that precluded all others. So it sometimes brought out the worst. Okay, just a couple more little sections here. And then I'm going to have my buddy Aaron come up here and we're going to do some songs. My mother grew up on a ranch in eastern Montana near Ekalaka, near Alzada actually. So I spent a lot of time there as a kid, and this is a little story from that time. One day when I was about 8, my grandparents took me to spend the day at the neighbor's, who had a boy the same age. Kelly Corneman was a typical ranch kid. He was quiet but friendly, with a dry wit and a great sense of adventure. When I went to visit Kelly, I knew it was going to be a good day. On this particular day, Kelly asked me whether I had ever ridden a calf. Of course, I said. This was a bold-faced lie. But I was a Montana kid. My dad had been on the rodeo team at MSU. He was even a rodeo clown for several years before he got stepped on by a bull, and my mother insisted he give it up. So I just knew, in the way that kids know things without any evidence whatsoever, that I would be able to ride that calf like a real cowboy. Kelly took me to the barn, and he fixed me up with chaps, gloves, and even spurs. He fastened a rigging around the calf's torso, and he showed me how to tuck my hand tight around the rope. We guided the calf into the chute, where I lowered myself from the rails onto his back. Kelly whipped that gate open just like they do at the Days of 85, and for about 5 seconds I rode that calf like a champion. But suddenly the calf stopped dead in its tracks, and I went flying. The way I remember it, I looked sort of like Superman, but I think it's a pretty good chance that I looked more like someone falling off a calf. I landed flat on my stomach, and my legs kicked up, so my spurs popped me in the back. For the next 10 minutes, I was pretty sure I was going to die. Kelly must have thought the same thing, because he rolled me onto my back, and he was crying like a baby. Then he did something I didn't understand at all. He crawled down to my feet, and he started to pull my boots off. What Kelly and I didn't know was that his father, Donnie, was watching this whole thing play out from the barn, laughing his ass off. And for years afterward, both of our families had a good laugh over the fact that Kelly Corneman wasn't about to let his friend die with his boots on. Okay, this is the last. Montana has so much history. One look at some of the splendor that exists in this place, and you find yourself searching for words. And it's not just the landscape. What's most beautiful about this place is the spirit of it. The way the people here love so hard and so thoroughly, whether it's the land or their families or their country. They love until it makes them blind, until they feel the need to barricade themselves against anything that threatens that love. They love with hearts so full that the blood can pump up and swell their view of themselves. The vast openness of this place can inspire your imagination until you believe you can accomplish anything. I've often driven along the eastern part of the state and thought about how riding across this country on a horse for weeks at a time could have given the imagination of someone like Custer so much time and room to grow that it blew up beyond the boundaries of a rational mind. Many people don't realize that part of what inspired Custer to make that harebrained charge was a growing ambition to become president. He had many people urging him to run, based in large part on his previous conquests. So he was hoping to add one more big victory to his resume to boost his chances of attaining our highest office. Despite the fact that his company had a desertion rate well over 50%, he was living in a world where he was invincible. Montana is a place that will not let go of you. I moved away in '96, and for many years after that, I kept renewing my Montana license plates, even though I moved to several different states. I was always proud when someone asked me about it or gave me a thumbs up from their own car. When I was living in San Francisco, someone once left a note in my windshield saying he was from Bozeman and he'd like to meet this other Montana person. So I dropped by his house. He really grilled me about the license plates. He wouldn't let it go, and I finally realized he was jealous. He wanted Montana license plates. I guess the final question becomes whether or not I found what I was looking for on this journey. Did I find any idea of what Montana represents, what it means to me, or to anyone for that matter? And to answer that, I turned to two final stories. When I was working on my grandfather's ranch when I was 16, my uncle and I were moving a flock of sheep when one of the lambs broke free. This was early in my time there, so I was eager to prove my skill on a horse. I took off after the little guy, digging my heels deep into my horse's flanks. But when I caught up to the lamb, he stopped, ran behind my horse, and broke off on a run again. I caught up to him 2 more times before I finally got it through my head that this wasn't going to work. I yelled something nasty at him, then turned my horse around and started trotting back toward the flock. And of course, when I turned around to see whether he was still running, he was following me back. A couple of days before I finished this book, I watched an 80-year-old woman fall and land hard on the back of her head. She was using a walker, and when she landed, the walker flipped over and hit her in the face. It was a horrific sight, unfolding just 10 feet from where I stood, and it brought up the worst feelings of helplessness and fear. The hardest part, though, was that this was my mother. We had just finished running tests at the hospital where we spent several hours shuttling from room to room. They fit her with an IV and gave her some kind of drug to simulate physical activity so they could take pictures of her heart and determine whether she was strong enough for surgery. The tests went well, and they took less time than we anticipated, but she was tired and a little weak from walking more than she usually did. Just before she fell, a man was in the process of Just before she fell, a man had picked up a form that had fallen from her walker. She was in the process of putting the form into the fold-up seat when I showed her where to sit in the waiting room while I went for the car. This combination of things led to her losing her balance, doing a slight pirouette and falling straight backwards, landing flat on her back. Her head smacked against the marble floor, and I was just one of many who shouted and ran to her. My mother and I have sometimes had a difficult relationship. We've often gone for long stretches without talking, but it's always been me that initiated these silences. She never once stopped talking to me, and each time I decided to talk to her again, she replied without the slightest hesitation. Perhaps because of this past, this incident affected me deeply. And then as I left the hospital that night, I broke into tears thinking about the look of terror on her face. I couldn't stop crying. I felt as if there were so many things I could have done to prevent it. If I had recognized how tired she was, I could have asked for a wheelchair. Or if I had just stayed with her for those 10 more feet that she needed to walk to the waiting room. But mainly, if I had just had the presence of mind to slow down and to notice what was happening. Mothers can be amazing in the way they forgive and still offer what they can. And I can't help but think about that fact, that this place we live in is referred to as Mother Earth. I can't help but wonder whether we don't take enough time to slow down and notice how forgiving she can be, no matter how much we ignore the warnings. There are so many things that happen every day, hour after hour, that prove in some small way that we have very little control over what happens in our lives. But when the health and safety of someone we love is directly affected, it brings home the most basic rule of life, that we are small, insignificant dancers in a very complex and chaotic ballet. But when you live in a place like this, you also eventually learn the futility of trying to tame these elements. You learn that a lamb running from the flock isn't the end of the world, that you aren't going to stop it from doing what it wants to do. You learn that no matter how hard you try to protect the ones you love, they will sometimes fall. And finally, you learn that the best way of getting what you want is by recognizing that we are all only temporary guests here, stewards of this place, and that by treating this place and its inhabitants with the respect they deserve, we improve our chances of having them come to us. Thank you. Let her go. Let her go, God bless her. She's mine anywhere she may be. She may tremble this wide world all over, but she'll never find a friend like me.
I went to church last Sunday. I saw my old true love there, and I knew that her mind was a-changing from the way that she'd done up her hair.
Let her go, God bless her. She's mine anywhere she may be. She may ramble this wide world all over, but she'll never find a friend like me.
I'm going downtown to the races, gonna watch my little pony run, and if I win any greenbacks, well, you know we're gonna have some fun.
Let her go, God bless her. She's mine anywhere she may be. She may ramble this wide world all over, but she'll never find a friend like me.